Hi, this is Mike Hogue from Lily House Permaculture, and today I wanted to do a quick little video to talk to some new gardeners who asked in our local permaculture group a great question about tilling, fertilizing, and mowing the lawn to protect the garden. And these three questions, really the idea was, do we have to till the garden? Um, and fertilizing. Do we have to fertilize the garden regularly to get a good yield? And finally, if we don't mow the lawn, is that going to provide habitat for pests and slugs and things like that? And those are great questions, and they show somebody has been really doing their gardening homework and has found some of this really good standard advice about gardening. So this is the thing, in permaculture, we often flip that kind of thing around because permaculture came out of the idea that the standard gardening advice for most home growers doesn't really work that great. See, this conventional advice was really all about how you maximize gross productivity. In farming, that's what conventional farmers are working about, is how to maximize their total production. And it doesn't matter what you have to put into it, so long as you get that maximum production. And same thing with horticulture scientists. They're really looking at studies, and the studies are all about, if we do, how do we get the maximum produce out of the system? But for home growers, we might often have more complex ideas than just gross productivity. Like, it might not make sense for us to get the maximum productivity if it costs us $20 to get a tomato by the end of the season. So we're more looking at the economics and whether they make sense, and also, other things like a conventional garden with a lot of chemicals and things isn't really a great place to live either. As home gardeners, we want to have a beautiful home environment. And I don't know about you, but I also would like to have a livable biosphere. So another thing we're looking at is, how do we sequester carbon? How do we clean and infiltrate water? How do we preserve biodiversity? A conventional approach to gardening doesn't do any of that. We want to do that. So let's look at those questions. So again, fertilizing is a great place to start. The conventional advice is, you have to fertilize periodically. The problem with that is when you start using imported chemical fertilizers, there's a ton of research that shows as soon as you do that, you start getting an increase in pests. It's like ringing the dinner bell for pests. And then you need pesticides. So it puts you on this thing called the pesticide treadmill, because once you start using pesticides, you're killing all of the natural predators that would eat the pests, and you're killing all of the biodiversity that would keep the plants safe from disease. Ecologists call this the biodiversity resiliency principle. It's the idea that the greater number of species there are in an ecosystem, the more resilience to pests and disease it gives to the individuals in that system, which means individual tomato plants or pepper plants. So once we start fertilizing, we're on that kind of situation. So instead, and that goes along with tilling, because once we're tilling, we're churning oxygen into the soil, and that causes the microbial life to go nuts, and then they're churning through the soil nutrients faster, and then you have to replace those nutrients because you burn them all off, metaphorically speaking, of course. So, but if you go to a system where the fertility is cycled more, you don't have to do that. So things like not tilling, keeping the soil covered, using lots of biodiversity in the garden means that you're not going to have to import fertilizer. So if you have tilled, you may eventually need some fertilizer. Oftentimes, if you've got some good growing lawn in our region, that's going to have enough nitrogen to get you through the first year. After that, you'll probably really see the growth really waning. If you want to be more natural, you can use about 2 inches of compost in the first year and 1 inch of compost covering the garden in every subsequent year, and that will maintain the soil fertility really well. Also, doing things like rotating crops if you're doing a conventional garden, or just having tons of biodiversity will help out. Um, so this also gets us to the other question of mowing the lawn. Yes, from a conventional perspective, having some wild areas around the garden, that's going to be a place where pests can live, including lawn. Things like slugs can be a big problem in the garden. But you know what eats a ton of slugs? In fact, probably more slugs than anything else in our climate? Fireflies. Fireflies, especially in their larval stage, eat slugs as their primary food. So, guess what fireflies need in order to complete their life cycle and have a larval stage? Long unmown grasses. So so we actually need areas of unmown grasses next to the garden. If we don't have that, then we won't have the predators, fireflies and other things, wasps, that eat the slugs. And so then we'll need to use chemicals again to control the slugs. So in a permaculture idea, we're getting back to that biodiversity resiliency principle as the way to prevent weeds and pests. Well, oh, and that's another thing I didn't mention. Once you use chemical fertilizer, you're going to have a problem with weeds too, because you're going to have excess nutrients, and weeds are going to go nuts off that. So this gets us back to this whole perspective of using ecosystems to help us grow our food, to maintain fertility, and to keep pests and weeds and diseases in check. And for that to work, we need whole, lush ecosystems that aren't being mown and that aren't being sprayed and aren't being tilled. So, sounds like somebody has been doing some excellent gardening research, and maybe now the next thing to do is to look into why things like permaculture, natural farming, look up Fukuoka, that's a great one, and alternative things like organics and biodynamics, why those have risen up as a response to conventional farming, which really doesn't work very well for a whole lot of people. All right, so that was a great question. I hope there was something interesting in this answer. Thanks.